Well, we asked Lisa to come up. Lisa Smith is from AIATSIS, the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies. Lisa is a late entry, and so I actually don't have the title of your talk in front of me, so I'm hoping that you'll be able to just run with it, introduce yourself, and thank you for being here, Lisa.
Thanks, Michaela. I begin by acknowledging the Ngunnawal peoples as traditional owners of the beautiful lands on which we gather, always was, always will be. I pay my respect to their elders, past and present. I extend that respect to all First Nations peoples and recognise their constant work to protect and nurture culture, language, identity and country. My name is Lisa Smith. I'm of Anglo-Celtic heritage. I'm the Assistant Director of the Archival Collections Unit at AIATSIS, which is a newly merged unit that incorporates the manuscript, photographic and audiovisual collections. I wish to also acknowledge that many of the practices that I'll share in this presentation have emerged as a result of efforts by First Nations peoples who have asked for decolonisation of archives and archival practices and worked tirelessly to develop sound strategies for this. Many of the Australian practices I will share are influenced by sources such as the ATS-Learn protocols, work by members of the Indigenous Archives Collective, and of course, many of my colleagues at AIATSIS, whose knowledge and dedication is a source of strength for me in my own role. So today I'm going to reflect on a cycle of dialogues that has been underway between the information management professionals at the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies, also known as AIATSIS, based here in Canberra, and the National Institute for Indigenous Peoples, also known as INPI, based in Mexico City, Mexico. Following the theme documentation and cataloguing of the cultural heritage of Indigenous people, each institution has presented on the following topics in a cycle of conversations across 10 sessions from June to November 2022. The themes have so far covered introduction to the INPI and AIATSIS collections, documentation and cataloguing, automation and access, digitisation, and a future session will cover preservation and conservation. So using this methodology of cycle of dialogues as inspiration, I'm going to alternate between sharing key content from the AIATSIS presentations and reflecting on how some key learnings from the INPI presentations cast different light on AIATSIS practices. What I observed overall is that each subtopic is in fact a shared interest, but our institutions place different emphasis on these elements in the work to preserve and support the revitalisation of cultures and knowledges of First Nations peoples as befits the local contexts. So I'm now going to highlight a few topics that seem like just juxtaposing concepts, but in fact feed each other and become somewhat blurred. So they are when to go slowly, when to proceed with urgency, when to be bespoke, and when to be standard. So the two institutes have commonalities in the way they originated and the way their focus and purpose has shifted. AIATSIS is an Indigenous-led organisation that celebrates, educates and inspires people from all walks of life to connect with the knowledge, heritage and culture of Australia's First People. AIATSIS holds the world's most extensive collection of collection materials dedicated to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander knowledge, history and culture. The archival collections are strong in the areas of language, music, contemporary culture, political history and many others. We also hold records that contain precious evidence of family histories and connections to community and place. The late Emeritus Professor W.E.H. Stanner was the main initial contributor to the collection. The collection was further built by offering grants to anthropologists, linguists, ethnomusicologists and archaeologists who went into the field and collected on and recorded Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander languages and cultures. The research gathered in the field was deposited at AIATSIS. At its inception, the Institute was focused on recording disappearing cultures, but it has evolved into an organisation that reflects the resilience of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and serves to support cultural survival and resurgence. The AIATSIS collection reflects this shift and so our approach to description must work in service of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who seek to find their cultures, languages, knowledges and histories within the collection. The history of INPI follows a similar narrative. It too has a past as a set of collections collated with an imperial sensibility, including exporting these representations to archives and museums of Europe and the United States. The predecessor organisation, the National Indigenous Institute, was created to save cultures that were presumed to not be able to preserve themselves. Today it is a vastly different set of collecting institutions where archival and cultural heritage is held for the benefit of the Indigenous peoples of Mexico. The cultural institutions that are part of the INPI portfolio include a bibliographic library, photo, sound and moving image archives, art collection, a history museum and an ancient customs museum. The collections are referred to as cultural patrimony, referring to heritage or birthright of the First Nations peoples of Mexico. Much like AIATSIS, it includes traditions and oral expressions, including language and collective memory, artistic expressions, including art and music, knowledges related to nature and the universe, art and craft, and traditional techniques. These collections demonstrate that Mexico is home to a great diversity of First Nations cultures, including 68 Indigenous languages, with at least half of them still at risk. Our two organisations have found an obvious partnership based on mutual understanding of the impacts of disconnection and dispossession from language, culture, place and family, and in revitalising languages and culture. The two institutes share a fundamental interest in returning the content and the benefits derived from these collections to the communities from which they came. So I'd like to start my discussion of the work to describe the AIATSIS collection by referring to an important concept that all of the AIATSIS presentations in the cycle of dialogues have referred to. AIATSIS operates in line with the concept of Yinjamara, a Wiradjuri word meaning to go slowly and act responsibly with wisdom and respect by considering the impact of words and actions. This concept is enshrined as an overarching principle for the future and for the present and future management of the AIATSIS collection. I find that this has relevance to the staff who work with the collection because we acknowledge that as archivists there is inherent power in how we go about our professional roles. We need to consider the impact of our decisions and seek advice from the communities whose knowledge is held in these collections. When communities are engaged in work around collections, this is a process of slow negotiation and communication. No one person can usually speak for materials, and there are layers of rights and restrictions that often need to be worked through. There are a lot of cultural safety risks in working in our environment, and so we operationalise Yinjamara also by encouraging moments of reflection on the work we are involved in, such as when we commence meetings or enter collection spaces. We also establish consent and collaboration at the start of projects. And as I listened to the presentations of our INPI counterparts, I was struck by the sense of urgency that they communicated as being a deep driver of their commitment to preservation. They are charged with preserving the evidence of change, continuity and vibrancy of the Indigenous cultures. A particular example of fragility that resonated with me were examples of confectionery items, sculptures made of sugar. I really don't envy the conservator that particular job. But even this innately fragile item doesn't begin to convey the depth of loss and forced disconnection from languages, rituals, family and other cultural expressions. Where culture has been threatened at best and lost at worst, there is an undeniable urgency to unlock the archives and ensure their contents are available to those who can rightfully revitalise them. Our two institutes share in a similar challenge of holding large volumes of audiovisual materials, many of which are under threat of what we are calling Deadline 2025. Deadline 2025 posits that in a few short years, the likelihood of being able to preserve magnetic medias will have decreased significantly as carriers degrade and machines reach end of life. The The image on the screen is an example of ingenuity that's arisen out of urgency. This is a custom designed tape cleaner designed by an engineer at AIATSIS. We too know the urgency of reconnecting the old people with collection materials that can be remembered, interpreted, added to and taught to the young people. For us at AIATSIS, therefore, our big picture is also urgency, balanced with thoughtfulness, respect and making room for the right conversations to happen with the right people. At AIATSIS, we put a lot of effort into developing more appropriate descriptive practices for the collection. We also do remediation of description as descriptive practices evolve, and I'll outline 2 examples. Firstly, I'll talk about the ways in which we acknowledge Indigenous intellectual and cultural property, ISIP for short. So based on the right for self-determination, ISIP rights are Indigenous people's rights to their heritage and culture. That's from Terry Janke and Company. Heritage includes all aspects of cultural practices, traditional knowledge and resources, and knowledge systems developed by Indigenous people as part of their Indigenous identity. ISIP rights also cover things like languages and types of knowledge, including spiritual knowledge. ISIP can differ in its specifics across nations or language groups, but a Yolngu Arnhem Land example is generally instructive. Yolngu copyright law is in place not to protect the artist, but to protect the image. Aboriginal traditional images, like Aboriginal land, do not belong to any one individual person. They belong to a group of people who relate to the image in a particular way. Communal ownership is accounted for in the protocols of ISIP in a way that it is not accounted for in copyright law. So how do some of these ideas translate into our practice? We hold, for example, rich language collections full of elicitations from language speakers. The collections are deposited by the linguist, so they're often named after the linguist. If the collection content even names its informants, their names may have still been left out of the archival description due to the shorthand practices of the past. The same goes for the collections of musicologists, anthropologists, and so on. So we're evolving our practice to take into account parallel provenance in our archival description. We do this in practice by describing intellectual property contributors in the initial descriptive parts of the finding aid, including the provenance, biographical notes, or the series description, and at folder or item level. Rather than perpetuating invisibility, it is appropriate to name those who are giving their intellectual property, and rather than referring to the language contributors as informants, which is how participants are often described in linguistic collections, and it also has connotations in terms of the power dynamics of that relationship, we instead acknowledge those contributors as knowledge holders or co-creators. I also want to highlight some of the work that my colleague has commenced to reformat standard finding aids so the content that is most important to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander users is prominent at the top of the document. For example, it now includes a section titled Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander content and subsections for community, language, country, cultural subject headings. These can actually still be crosswalked to mark and coding standards in catalogue records. And the less relevant parts of the finding aid, the administrative stuff, has been shifted to the end. So this is an approach we'll actually continue to test, run through a case study and continue to think about any changes. And as a standards-driven archive and library, when we shift or amend our standards, we do so for the express purpose of better serving our clients to find and connect with the content of the collections. INPI sessions strongly express the value of leveraging the metadata standards and systems infrastructure of the information management sector to maximise accessibility of their collections. The exchange of information with other institutions is a very prized outcome, and INPI's work to develop standards-based formats for sharing their specialist collections represented watershed work. This automation and standardisation also creates efficiencies in responding to access queries, which again speaks to the urgency of serving access, as it is the gateway to revitalisation that may occur around these records. And much like AIATSIS, INPI are using the Conventions of Information Management standards to influence new standards. For example, in their development of MARC records, ensuring that the accents are utilised in Spanish description and that the subject headings applied to the records are relevant to how First Nations communities in Mexico would classify and search for heritage materials. These are important standards and communication protocols for improving accessibility outcomes. There is something valuable for us here to reflect on, namely that institutions such as ours, where Western views of collection and information management dominate, we need to constantly assess our relationship with standards. It is indeed valuable to leverage what is useful and amend those standards that are not well aligned with the outcomes of shifting the balance of power back to the traditional owners of these knowledges and cultures. While it is not valuable to compare one context and culture with another, it is nevertheless critical to share practices and challenges with peer organisations. It is valuable to take these opportunities, such as dialogues, to reflect on and assess methodologies. Are they achieving the outcomes you think they are for your stakeholders? The simple cyclical act of sharing our practices and having practices reflected back to us by our Mexican counterparts has cumulatively revealed new perspectives on our challenges and opportunities to us. So finally, I hope this talk offers some encouragement to the professionals who are yet to see their organisations embrace initiatives such as Tandanya and take meaningful steps to shift the power dynamics in archives. It really does begin with taking small, simple steps that align with what is being asked of us.
Thank you so much for that thought-provoking talk, Lisa. Thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you, James, Lisa, and Katrina. James and Lisa, do you want to grab your chairs and sit up on the stage, or we've got some time for questions, and I'm hoping that there will be some arms being raised very quickly. But I might kick off first with in order of presentation for you, James. I'm not sure I'm going to articulate this well. It's been a long day, but I was wondering if you could reflect on the gaps, the skill gaps in digital preservation to manage those. Particularly, I was thinking about the census data a longer time period. Where they're being created by people and then they're being managed by digital preservationists, but there's skill gaps in the middle that might represent some real risk.
Yes, I think you're right. And let me put it this way, that one thing we're finding with Australian government agencies is that a lot of them are creating these big research data sets, BOM, ABS, geoscience, you name it, and they have their own domains and they're very good within those domains. Now, if that material gets transferred into custody, we don't necessarily understand those domains and the standards and all the rest of it that goes with them. So you're quite right that there is a capability gap there. Now at the National Archives, we're sort of conscious of digital capability, and I think tomorrow Eva Samaras is going to be talking about our efforts around digital capability, but there's necessarily going to be gaps because of the incredible range of information and information domains that are out there in government agencies and which are Commonwealth records, and that therefore, it's our responsibility to manage that stuff. So
the challenge of our time. And Lisa, I was wondering, I was really fascinated by hearing about the collaboration between the two countries and their collections, and my mind immediately went to whether or not there's other collaborations similar to the ones that you talked about happening or in train.
Yeah, so for, I'm going to say at least a year, we've had an international engagement branch this is one of the first partnerships that we've actually been working within. And the cycle of dialogues is only a small part of that partnership, actually. There's other parts to that program, and much of it has been worked through at this point. And it's going to lead to more as we have conversations through different modes, and we really get into the nitty-gritty with our fellow practitioners. So yes, I am aware that there's a partnership forming with, I believe, with one of our, within the Oceania region, and I expect there'll be more to come. I have heard of another, so it is valuable for us to be working with international partners. There's much to learn from people who are working with First Nations materials. There are lots of great protocols being considered across the world, and where we can contribute to that conversation, we absolutely want to. And yeah, it's a fertile.
Thank you. Well, it should be interesting, and what a great job that would be. And Katrina, finally, thank you. I was really excited to hear about that archive. I spoke about working with climate scientists this morning, so it's front of centre for me to think about not just making our archives accessible to scientists, but making scientists' archives accessible to the world, and particularly Dr. Hawkins. You, in somewhat, answered my question, because it was about the gaps and the things that haven't been yet collected, and the sort of what would be possibly described as the more ephemeral, the graffiti and the fan art and things like that. I wonder if you could reflect on what's being done, if anything, to collect those, or is it just a wish list?
Yeah, there is some material, and we'd hope to include that with the archive at some point. But the photo that you saw, the Be Curious one of the graffiti on the wall, that was just something that was found in Cambridge by a colleague. So I suppose we'd need to have a more proactive documentation process to capture some of that. But I think there will be opportunities for that as the existing archive is catalogued and we're able to make that more available to people. And it's likely that would create offers of other material that others hold. And in fact, someone sent me actually very early on in the piece, someone sent me from British Columbia, sent me a photograph of a Stephen Hawking sand sculpture that had been made on a beach in British Columbia. And I did accession that into the collection.
And now over to the floor. We've got a roaming microphone. We've got Morgan. We've got some questions that have been online.
Yeah, I have a question here from Brad Weir for James. And Brad is asking, do you think that there is a need or a place for a universal language that could be put in place to make cross-agency collaboration easier?
Yes, that's a good question. Cross-agency collaboration. Wouldn't it be nice if everybody understood the series system, and what a series registration is, and our schemas? But I mean, frankly, I just really don't think it's feasible, given just the differences in these domains that I'm talking about. So, at a minimum, we do say, we need a series description to understand the record-keeping systems. We need item metadata to understand, the aggregations of these different hierarchies. But the problem, of course, is when you're talking about big business systems, database systems, they don't map with our item-level schemas, though they do map well with the Australian Government record-keeping metadata schema. But at least at the very minimum, you can get titles, dates, you can itemise, data sets that way. One thing I was going to say with big business systems, they contain millions of database records that don't really fit within our item level control. You can't do it that way, but you can at least itemise them at the level of the data set, can't you? I mean, you know, the universal lingua franca for the archives is the series system. It's just trying to have other agencies understand the series system is a different matter. You know, one thing we've found is when you're talking to agencies about these things, getting the records managers, the data experts, the IT people all in the same room to talk about our archival requirements. So anyway, I've talked too long. I think it's because I can't really answer it.
Have we got any other online questions? Back to the floor then. We've got a question up in the... Hello, Catherine.
Hello, from the gods. Hi, my question is for Katrina. Hi, Katrina. With personal papers, we're often taking things in different, like in tranches over time. But I was interested in the split between the physical and the digital, and that the digital doesn't yet have a place in an archives. Could you just comment about that, and any comments on the approach to appraisal and description, given that you're dealing with something which is partial and not like lots of different sets of papers over time? It was created contemporaneously. So, yeah, any comment on that?
Hi, Catherine. Nice to hear from you. So that's a really good question. I think in terms of, I know that Susan is constantly saying, oh, you know, this stops here, and you know, we need to get on with the digital archive, and we very much hope that's going to be a part of it. I think what's interesting about Hawking's archive is that it's a paper. The part that we're looking at is basically the paper artifact for much of it of a digitally created archive. So we can't fully see the complexity of the different texts and how they are repeated or used in different contexts and all of that kind of stuff. So the idea of being able to sort of trace all the talks that he gave and what their relationship was to each other, that's quite hard with the paper archive. So I suppose that's why I feel the appraisal process is sort of ongoing, and it's a bit like watch and wait. It's also not really fully understanding the significance of all items, and quite a lot of work to sort of put the context back around those.
Thank you, and thank you for that question. That was on my mind too. I think we've got time for... No, we are at time. So I just want to wrap up by saying thank you to James, Lisa and Katrina, 3 very interesting talks this afternoon. That wraps up our day. There's no more housekeeping, so I will let you all go and on to the next. Thank you very much.